class, and we'll be jumping back and forth from this and Cinema 4D to see where we are at each stage and what we need to create next. So to begin, we're going to create the main landscape that you see in this example, these kind of hills with these sharp edges and the grid lines and so on. Let's start with that. If I get a plane, and I want to be able to see the segments here, so let's go to display and go to growth shading with lines. And I want to give this a width of 10,000. So that's in the attributes over here. So 10,000 centimeters, and then a height of 20,000 centimeters. So let's add another 0 there. And this is all being built into the Z direction. All right. So let's call this our landscape. We need a lot more segments. Let's go for 200 in the width and 400 for the depth. And we end up with these many square segments making up this one piece of geometry. So let's take a look at this. It's this raised areas that have been displaced, and then some areas are flat, but then some areas you have the hills. So to do this, we're going to use a Displace Deformer in Cinema 4D, and that's found under this icon. If I hold left click, it will reveal all the various deformers which are in this menu, and we are looking for the displacer. Let's make it a child of the landscape, and this is the kind of setup you need for this to have an effect. In the shading tab, let's go to shader, add a noise map, and when I do that, you will now see the geometry being displaced, but so far it's a very subtle effect. We need this to be much stronger. So if I go to object, I will go to the height control and set this to 2000. And it's going to be much stronger now. So I'm going to zoom out here, and you can see it just looks a bit crazy and chaotic. So let's go back and make some further changes in the shading once again. Let's jump into the noise map itself, and we're going to change the noise type from the default noise to fire. And it's going to look like everything is completely broken. That's fine. Let's change the space the noise is currently set in from texture to UV 2D. And when I do that, now it's starting to look like what we want. The problem now is the ground plane is way down here when it should be directly under the car. So let's go back to the displacer itself, and in the object tab, let's change the intensity, or rather this type here, from intensity centered to just intensity. And when I do this, it's going to bring the ground level to the correct level, I suppose. So it's working, but our car is now stuck somewhere underneath this particular section, but it is at the ground level. So what we want to do now is make a clearing for our road and car to go through right down the middle of this geometry, and that's exactly what we have in this final piece. To do this, let's just go back to our shader, because currently, if you look at this, the black parts of the noise map correspond to the flat parts of the geometry, and then the white parts represent the parts which are raised up, as you can see here, the displaced geometry there. So we need to create a black line down the middle of this map to clear a space or an area for the car and road to go over. So to do this, we need to stack some layers together. So next to the noise shader, once again, or on top of it rather, let's open this up and create a layer. And what this would do is just take everything we've created so far, and now we can stack various layers on top of each other. And I am in the layers now, and I can always go back to this level and just click to go back in. And under shader, I want a gradient shader. And as soon as I insert this, you can see that the black area of the gradient corresponds to the lower side of the displacement, and then, you know, as it shifts across this way, the white part is the highest, and that's over on this side of the gradient. So we can actually jump into the gradient, and let's move the black point to the middle, and we'll create a new white point over on the left side. Just double click anywhere to create a new gradient handle. Just to make sure that this is dead centered, this new or this extra black layer, or the black line rather, let's right click and distribute the knots. And that's going to be equally spaced out now. We can go back a level, and the gradients blending mode should be set from normal to multiply. And this is now going to be blended with the noise map underneath, and you can see now that we have made a clearing down the center of our landscape. Now, this effect currently is too gradual and too wide. You can see it fades in just like the gradient does. We want it to be much steeper and have a more clearly defined line down the middle here. So let's go back into the gradient and create more white handles either side of the black center line. The actual number here should be 7. That's what I used in the original example. So you can go ahead and do something a bit different, or just use the same as me if you want identical results. Anyway, let's also create a second black handle, and then right click and distribute the knots also. And if you have done this correctly and there are an equal number of white knots either side of the two here, it should create a perfect clearing down the center of our geometry. And that's what we have here. So let's go back up a level. I will go to display and just have grow shading. And you can see how this is starting to look. Another issue here is that Cinema 4D is smoothing the surfaces of this geometry, whereas we want something that looks a bit sharper and more of a grid and a polygon kind of geometric style. And this is being this smoothing is being done by the Fong tag here. This just tries to smooth over geometry, and when it's needed, it works great, but we don't need it in this case. Anyway, let's lower the Fong angle to, let's say, 10 degrees. And when I do that, you see now that our geometry just looks a bit sharper. But actually, we can just completely get rid of this completely, and there we go. That's the look that we need. Another step is the grid lines you see over the polygons. These were generated using something called the atom array in Cinema 4D. So before we do that, we first need a copy of this landscape that we have so far. And to do this, we're going to use an instance object. This is found under this menu. We go to instance, and with the original object selected, it will automatically name this the correct way. So it's an instance of the landscape, and it will also automatically link the reference object, which is the original landscape object. If that doesn't happen by default, you can always just drag this in here, and this is going to work also. Anyway, an instance is just another way of saying a copy. As you can see now, I have 2 versions of this landscape. And the great thing about this is if I go into the original object, let's say the displacer, and make any changes, it automatically updates the instance. So if I turn this back on, you see it updates over here also. Okay, anyway, we want to use the instance with the atom array to create those lines you saw on the edges there. So if I can find the atom array, it's under the same menu. It's right here. And let's put the instance as a child of the atom array. And when I do that, you will now see a new set of polygons or geometry based on the shape of the original landscape. Now, we don't need as many segments as we currently have. If I go to lines, you can see that each of these links has about 8 polygons going around. So let's lower the subdivisions to just 4. And also the cylinder radius is going to be 0.5. And the sphere radius is also going to be 0.5. And in this case, the sphere is the joint points, and the cylinder are these actual lines you see in between each joint. Let's make them both the same size, and then you will no longer see the joints, as you can see there. And that's it for the main landscape. In the next lesson, we will look at the other elements in our scene.